Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast Network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
2022 was Toys for Tots' 75th anniversary and also their record-breaking year, distributing over 24 million toys to nearly 10 million less fortunate children. Toys for Tots is not just a Christmas time charity, they're a year-round force for good. Thanks to their supporters, Toys for Tots is able to support children in need beyond Christmas time through their year-round programs. You can make a difference today. Learn more about their year-round force for good at toysfortots.org.
Hello world, you're listening to Strategicon, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. We hope you had a Merry Christmas and we wish you all a Happy New Year. It is Monday, December 26, 2016, episode 21, and I'm your host, John Bruni. Today we are honored to be joined via Skype by Dr. Jonathan Z. Ludwig, who is visiting assistant professor of Russian at Oklahoma State University and member of the SAGE International Australia Advisory Board. Dr. Ludwig was formerly with Rice University, Houston, Texas, as Senior Lecturer of Russian, Faculty and Asian Studies member, Faculty Senate member, and on the Examinations and Standings Committee. Before we start today's episode, I would like to remind listeners that Strategicon can be found on iTunes, SoundCloud, YouTube, and our podcast on the SAGE International Australia website, www.sageinternational.org.au. In today's episode, we'll be returning to a topic that has fascinated us for a very long time, and that is Russia's role in the world today. What makes this topic so enduring is that Russia is far from being considered a near-peer competitor of the United States, yet its global standing is solid even though its economy has been wrecked by US-led international sanctions. Still, it has managed to outmaneuver the United States strategically in the Middle East by injecting itself into Syria and cozying up to Iran and Turkey, in Europe by threatening the Baltic and consolidating its hold over eastern Ukraine, and in Asia through its growing strategic bonds with a rising China. And now, with investigations underway in the United States over Russia's role in helping Donald Trump win the US presidency, Moscow seems in many ways more powerful and certainly bolder than the old Soviet Union. So what makes Russia so resilient? How is a country that by all accounts should be on the ropes still managing to actively resist US power globally? Today we turn to Russian specialist Jonathan Z. Ludwig for answers to these perplexing questions. Good afternoon, Jonathan.
Good afternoon, John. Hello, world.
Russian leader Vladimir Putin has dominated the narrative of post-Soviet Russia. Putin seems to be the strategic genius who has single-handedly brought a poor and humiliated Russia back to the world stage. But surely Putin's successes cannot be attributed so narrowly. Can you tell us what the natural strengths of Russia are that make the country so resilient, so ambitious, and so willing to see things from Putin's perspective?
Sure. I think the resilience in large part comes just from Russian history, right? Most of Russian history is the history of invasion. If you look at, Great Britain, you look at America, you look at Australia, right? We're surrounded by oceans or friendly countries. It's very hard to attack here. But if you look at Russia throughout its history has really been the land bridge between Western Europe and Asia, and everyone crosses it sometimes several times. The Vikings invaded first, arguably founded Kievan Rus. The Mongol invasions where the Mongols stayed for a couple hundred years. Polish-Lithuanian Empire, Sweden, Napoleon, Hitler, and then Stalin himself was not the first Russian leader by any means, to really attack and imprison its own people. You can't help but be resilient if you're still a nation after really a millennium of invasions and attacks from outside.
So, as the importance of Russian studies has declined since the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, what role do you think this has played in a general Western ignorance of Russian motives and of any genuine understanding of the Russian state?
Well, as an American, if you don't mind a baseball metaphor, we're really sort of weak on the bench when it comes to Russian studies. The Washington Post wrote at the end of 2015, about a year ago, that we really have a missing generation of Russianists or Slavists who can deal with policy, who can really understand Russia in any type of depth. After 1991, the funding got cut. Some of it was moved over to Eastern Europe. A lot was moved over to Central Asia. Russia primarily disappeared. After 9/11, the funding that was left really went understandably to Arab studies. Now a lot of it is going to Chinese studies and somewhat Korean studies, because of North Korea. You just don't have these people who have been funded for all that amount of time. Title VIII has been cut. Title VI, which gives National Resource Center money to institutions around the country, that's disappearing, and Fulbright has undergone a number of battles in the last 4 years just to keep its funding and keep its existence. Really with that being the background, in just the last 5 years, it's really not that surprising that we don't have that many Russian experts. We're pulling out old Soviet-era experts and putting them on TV.
It sounds strange listening to this, because essentially what it seems to be is that foreign policy is kind of taken on a bit of a fashionista title. It's a matter of whatever's going at the moment, in spite of the fact that there are underlying currents and continuities that should be taken care of. Yes, we understand that the world changes, and we understand that threats change, and we need to be responsive to those things. But there are also these other more enduring things to the international system that also need to be paid attention to, which seems to just disappear from view.
And I think a lot of that is, based on the political system, right? Again, in the U.S. here, we're traditionally very safe from the outside world. There's always been this current of isolationism running sort of, in the American psyche. So unless somebody sees that there's an immediate need, they don't want it funded, which means Congress won't necessarily fund it because they have to answer back to the voters. It was easy to fund Russian studies during the Cold War because, there was that great looming threat over there, right? Soviet missiles pointed toward Europe, adventurism in Afghanistan, Africa, other places. It was a threat that everyone could see. It was playing on the news every night. Russia's back in the news again, in the last 2 or 3 years. But again, that's new. And we're very, very slow to react to these things.
For many years, Indonesia was the looming threat to Australia in terms of our national security consciousness. The nature of the threat now has changed, and it's now about terrorism that sort of originates in Indonesia. But the notion of the Indonesian state being an important strategic partner to Australia seems to have fallen out of favour. So we're going through our own kind of process here in Australia, trying to deal with our next door neighbour, because at the moment Indonesian studies is not being favoured by the national security elite over here. We also are sending our forces overseas to support American efforts in the Middle East. And so again, we've got that kind of very flippant notion of the enduring strategic character of Australia, just like what you're describing in the United States vis-a-vis Russia.
And you also have Australian National University, which just last year devastated their Asian language studies program.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that they reorganized it, but they got rid of a lot of language teachers, a lot of the area, and that doesn't help for the long term either.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. Okay, so returning back to Russia, can we ever hope to really understand Russia if it indeed is, as Churchill once said, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma?
Well, if you don't mind, I'm going to respond with a Russian poem by Fyodor Tyutchev, who wrote in the 1800s, "Russia cannot be understood by the mind. No ordinary yardstick can span her greatness. She stands alone, unique. In Russia, one can only believe." Now, this was retorted to by a 20th century poet by the last name of Oleshkovsky, who wrote rather crudely, and I'll tone it down for our delicate-eared audience out there. It's about damn time to start understanding Russia with the mind. And I think a lot of this is, right, how do you understand the Anglosphere? You understand the Anglosphere through the political system, right? When America was founded, everything that came out that sort of describes how what you were traditionally means to be an American came out in those political debates. We can debate today, and that's the subject of a completely different discussion, how well it's followed, but everything is in the political discourse. This is where those debates originally take place. This doesn't happen in Russia, right? There are no free, open political debates in Russia. There never really have been outside of some democratic constituent assemblies that were elected back in ancient Novgorod, which is the place where they had sort of a traditional democracy, right? If you want to figure out what Russia's all about, you need to read the Russian literature, look at Russian culture, look at Russian history. All the debates take place there. Russian literature is not always the most accessible to the West. It's not all been translated. A lot of it's not been translated well. And some of the philosophy that shows up there, without the background information, without the history of Russia, without the other history, of the Western world, of the Eastern world, to give you the context, doesn't really make, an easy amount of sense just to that initial reader.
Okay.
And I think this is one of the reasons it's a real challenge to understand Russia.
Does a sense of civilizational pride carry the Russian people through trials and tribulations to see them triumph, no matter the cost? Is this the Russian way? What does Russian literature tell us about the nobility of suffering and the triumph of sacrifice for the common good?
Dostoevsky wrote, "Pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. The really great men must, I think, have great sadness on earth." And you see this in the character of Raskolnikov, murders the old woman, has to commit that sin in order to be arrested, to be punished, and only in that way can he be redeemed. So you do have this theory of suffering to sort of purge yourself as sin, to make yourself reborn, to redeem yourself in Russian literature. But you also have to remember, if you understand, if it's possible to sort of carry within your DNA history, while some countries in the world sort of proudly bear their history, brag about their history, for Russia, history's been a great burden. This, I think, weighs down upon the idea of the Russian soul, where they carry, as we talked about earlier, this history of invasion, this history of political debate written between the lines rather than be open, this history of not knowing when you're going to disappear, somebody you love is going to disappear. That's a great burden to carry, and it's been most of Russian history for 1,000 years.
Which then suggests to me, at least, that Russia will always be an outlier in terms of the West's ability to reach out to it and try to really come to grips with it. There's no natural Western sense of itself which the West can make sense of, if you get my drift. So it's a very perplexing kind of situation, isn't it?
Hire more Russian teachers.
Yes, well said. Absolutely. Yeah, why not?
But that's the start of it, right? Russia has disappeared from the public discourse, has disappeared from the educational discourse. So, when I was growing up during the Cold War, everyone had an opinion on Russia. Educated, uneducated, rumors you heard, things you thought about. Everyone had something they could say about Russia.
Yes.
The same way nowadays people have things that they can say about China or about the Middle East, or if you look at the last American election, Muslims, in a larger context, right? Everyone has something they can say because it's in the public discourse. Russia's disappeared from that. And this is really the challenge, is were those next Russian experts going to come anywhere in the West if it's not in the public discourse, if someone doesn't get interested in Russia from really a young age? As far as where does Russia lie, how do you deal with it? This is really one of the quintessential questions of Russian history, culture, etc. The Russians ask themselves, right? Are they a Western nation? Are they an Eastern nation? Are they something else, right? In the 1800s, Pyotr Chadaev, Russian philosopher, writes on the philosophical letters where he starts questioning what was the idea of Slavophilism, right, which was really Russophilia, right? It was really Russia seeing itself as, a unique entity, as something different, something not of the East, something certainly not of the West. And for his troubles, he was institutionalized for a while, because how could you possibly criticize Russia? But the opposite side of this were the Westernizers, the people who thought Russia had never offered anything of worth to the world, never would, and the only way to really build up Russia would be to bring in a Western political system, to bring in Western ideas such as industrialization and things like that. And this is really still a battle that rages today. What is this Russian identity? You see it in the two major cities. Moscow is very much a Russian city, right? It grows organically, it's grown naturally over time. There's a Kremlin in the middle. Everything else has just sort of grown as it needed to. St. Petersburg is a beautiful recreation of Amsterdam, right? It is the Western city Peter the Great built it specifically as his window onto the West. And you've really had this tug and pull between the two. Are we Russian? Are we Western? Are we Russian? Are we Western? And Asia plays a small role in that as well. But for the most part, the battle is between, sort of a modern-day battle between the Slavophiles and the Westernizers. It continues today in their outlook.
If we can return just briefly to the idea of having more Russian experts to try to plumb the depths of what's going on in that country, I suppose critics could say that we had an army of experts prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all those experts totally misread what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. How would you retort that?
There were a handful of them that got it right. Martin Malley, I believe, is one of the few historian scholars that predicted the downfall of the Soviet Union. There were a handful of other ones as well. Also, during the early 1980s, the eminent historian Richard Pipes was asked to be chairman of Team B. And what they did with Team B is they basically brought in a bunch of outside experts. It was military heavy because the debate then was the same debate that was going on during the Eisenhower switch over to Kennedy, which was, is there a missile gap? And Team B basically by the end of a very long, months-long process became Team A. Theirs was the one that was accepted as fact. And while the Soviets certainly did have a lot of missiles, what was missed is, what was also missed in Iraq and some other places, they weren't always in the best of shape. Would they have actually gone off had they been used? So, there were people who got it right. There were also people, who weren't really given a chance to get it right? The people who were arguing this system was rotten to the core, that really didn't play into the public discourse, especially when it comes to government funding.
Right.
Especially if it's the military that what's the funding, right? Saying that they're weak inside rotting away really doesn't help with that.
If we then turn to the thorny issue of education. In terms of education, while we can deride the West for its almost willing disregard of knowledge that comes from active engagement and hard work, is this the case in Russia? Do Russians have a different appreciation for the human capital of education that accounts for their ability to outfox the West at every turn?
I think by the time World War II was over, education had taken a major turn in the Soviet Union where they wanted everyone to become educated. Right? So they started under the communists initially, right? Illiteracy went away, women started being educated. These things didn't happen in the traditional Russian space. The change was more probably practical than anything else. Suddenly they woke up post-World War II in a very modern world, one of two superpowers. So, so basically a lot of money was put into education, very technical education, right? Not, sort of like what you would get in China, Asia today, not the humanities so much, but this very technical, engineers, right? You're building a new society. You're not building human souls as they would say.
Yep.
These days, I think it's taken a turn back and is probably falling into some of the patterns of the West. Some universities you can get higher degrees by simply bribing the right officials. That's a lot harder to do in the West, I believe. And the other, I hope it is anyway, as a professor. I saw you laughing. But the other issue is, if you wanted to leave the Soviet Union and you were highly educated or smart, it was impossible. They just wouldn't give you that exit visa. In the last couple of years, it's been basically, if you look at Putin's poll ratings, they've slipped a little bit, but they're still, very high up there. That 10 to 15 to 20% of the people opposed to him are the highly educated people. His response has been, if you don't like it, leave.
Yeah.
So in some ways, he's actually encouraging a brain drain, encouraging these people to leave the country, and that can't be good long term for Russia.
No, certainly not. If we look at Putin a bit more specifically, is he the giant upon whose shoulders lies Russian ambitions and capabilities? What happened to the Russian democratic opposition, and why was it so successfully rooted by the pro-Putin forces?
Democracy, as we both know, democracy is a relatively weak form of government, right? Pretty much every American president, I'm sure premiers of other democracies, always state at some point during their time they wish they could be a dictator, they could get things done. It's a messy form of government. It's not easy to get things done. That's designed on purpose. And it involves a lot of freedom, right? Freedom of choices, freedom to make decisions, freedom to debate these ideas. None of these really have a tradition in Russia. So when the Soviet Union fell apart, 1991, communism had done 70 years of harm. Everything had, basically everything had been shattered. The free markets were gone. Nothing like that worked. You can't fix that overnight. Yeltsin came in seen as a very strong leader, right? He stood up on the tanks when the last sort of hardliners in the Soviet Union tried to overthrow Gorbachev. But when push came to shove, there's really nothing he could do to fix Russia overnight, because there's nothing anybody could have done to fix Russia overnight. And, as Russia started to lose its status in the world, started to seem, more weak in the world, right? NATO grew, China became more aggressive, Japan, the economic problems of the 70s and 80s in Asia turned around, so those countries became stronger. The Baltics became free, Central Asian nations became free. Russia lost a lot. And as Yeltsin's health began to fall, as he drank more, as he had heart problems, that just sort of became symbolic of a Russia falling apart. And by that time, Russia's very in tune with images. And if you see your president not on TV very much, right? If you see your president, doing a little dance, spinning a microphone with a German rock band, and then having to disappear leading up to the election, you wonder if something's going on. And this harkens back to the days of the Soviet leaders when they would disappear, but nothing was really changing in the country. It just sort of plodded along. But here, as Russia was dying, Russia was falling apart, right? The rest of the world was growing. So I think in that way, and that became synonymous with democracy in a lot of Russians' minds. They saw democracy as this messy system. It meant they no longer got their pensions. It meant that grocery stores where maybe you could find something, now you couldn't find anything. Or if the grocery stores were full, you couldn't buy anything because inflation had skyrocketed prices. So in that way, that sort of discredited what really wasn't democracy yet, and certainly wasn't a free market economy. But a lot of Russians who were elderly at that point remembered coming through World War II, right? Remembered being the first nation to launch a man into space. Remembered splitting the atom in relative time faster than the U.S. because they stole the secrets, but you still have to figure out a way to make it work, right? They saw that Soviet Union as compared to this crumbling Russia. Yeltsin went through, I don't know how many prime ministers, right? He had to fire on his own government because his vice president and his Speaker of the House wouldn't cooperate. If you wonder why there's no longer a vice president in Russia, it's because the last vice president they had helped to stage the coup against the sitting president. So you just change your system of government.
Yep.
So because of that, you have somebody come in, right? Go back, look at all the images of Putin, right? Why doesn't he wear a shirt? Because that makes him look tough, that makes him look manly, right? We in the West laugh at these after a while. I think even the Russians laughed at the Grecian urns that were left intact on the beach for him to find. But you have this image of sort of, like super Putin, right? The super guy who exudes strength, who exudes masculinity, everything that not only Yeltsin didn't do at the end, although to be fair, he did at the beginning, but no Soviet leader ever did.
Interesting that you should say that, because, at the moment, if you look at the narrative with regard to the West's relations with Russia, one could almost be forgiven for thinking that because Putin is resisting American power, he has no right to do so because he is an autocrat, he's a bad guy, and he's a Russian. And yet, if we look at the 1990s and we look at the rapid pace of NATO expansion towards Russia's sort of borders, you kind of start thinking, well, does Russia, irrespective of the government of Russia, but does Russia actually have a right to have a national interest in pushing America back from its borders? Or is it a case of, if you're not with Team America, you have no right in that sense? It's a very difficult one to juggle, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think you have to remember there was resistance in the West to allowing some of these Eastern European nations into NATO in the first place, some of which was financial, some of which was the concern about irritating Russia. But they were the ones who really, really wanted to join. The Baltics, especially the Baltics, were most insistent because they wanted the NATO umbrella to protect them from a resurgent Russia that they knew would come at some point. Gorbachev swears that Secretary Baker promised that there would be no NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, Secretary Baker, to the best of my knowledge, promises that he never said that. So even there, two people who talk regularly can't agree on what was actually done or said. But I'm saying, I remember, those were my grad school years here, following, a great amount of debate on, do we expand at all? Do we let them in? At what level? If memory serves, we actually had to sell Bulgaria the 5 planes that they had to have to sort of get into NATO. So once the decision was made, then, we tried to let everybody in, just to really, and from Western Europe's point of view, is probably the trigger buffer zone to Western Europe.
Are we actually seeing a resurgent Russia, though, Jonathan? I mean, you made mention about that just a moment ago. I mean, are we seeing that happening before our eyes?
I'm not sure if they're resurgent in the way of getting stronger. I'm more of the opinion they're resurgent because they're doing it from a form of weakness, right? The Soviet Union, for better or for worse, and I'm running the risk of sounding like a liberal here, and that will disappoint some of my fans, but offered a different system. A system that in retrospect nobody uses anymore, except maybe North Korea. But I mean, they offered a different way of life. Russia offers none of that, really. Putin really seems to be trying to upset the world order rather than trying to create a new world order. And I think that's really the difference between the 50s and the 60s, a little bit in the 70s, and today. The Soviet Union was trying to create a world order under their umbrella, and the world was fairly divided at that time. And nowadays, Putin is saying, I don't have the strength to do this. Nobody really wants to follow us. Let me see what I can do to mess other things up. And right now, he's doing it to the U.S., but he's doing it to the U.S. and the Western order in places like Syria, which is doing them even more harm.
Which raises another question. Is Russia now a force for global instability? And how do you think the investigations that are currently taking place within the United States as with regard to Russia's role in electing Donald Trump as president-elect, how do you think that this is going to all play out? Do you think that this will show a fundamental kick to the US system which will destabilize democracy as we know it? Or do you think this was just a foolish thing done in a fit of rage and it'll all blow over and everything will be okay in the end?
I mean, this is something that I think Russia under Putin has been building toward. They have a dedicated building, at least in St. Petersburg. There's probably one in Moscow, whose job is basically to get online, and anytime there's an article about Putin or Russia, to basically refute it, go after these people, attack them, basically to serve as official government trolls. Right. So in some ways, I think sending out the fake news, leaking the information out, is sort of maybe like the high point of that. Now, where it goes from here is anybody's guess. And that may, in large part, depend on if Trump ever comes around and is willing to admit there's a Russia problem, and there seems to be little to no movement on that. Mm-hmm. And if Congress actually has an open, and by open I mean really they're looking at all the information, some will be classified, of course, it can't be open, but whether they actually take a good hard look at everything and what comes out of that. I think that the incoming Trump administration wants it buried in set committees already, because I believe they think that some of the chairs of those committees are their supporters, so they won't let a lot of harmful information out. John McCain, Lindsey Graham have really been the two Republican senators on the forefront of this. One a special committee. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that would take sort of be similar to Iran-Contra. It was very open, where you had lawyers from both sides looking at things, or if it would be a joint House-Senate committee that would largely meet behind closed doors because of the security aspects of it. That remains to be seen, and it really depends on what the Senate and House decide to do first.
With Inauguration Day coming up, I'm curious as to what you think Trump's future is going to be with this Russian cloud hanging over his head. Do you think it is likely that he will be impeached? Do you think that this is going to fundamentally destabilize his ambition to be president of the United States?
Unless there are I don't think he'd be impeached over this. I think unless there are some clear ties between the Trump campaign and Russia to coordinate this, Russia could do whatever it wants in an election, the way China has before. But unless they actually specifically gave money that he knew about or somehow coordinated it, it probably isn't an impeachable offense. And as far as I understand in my limited constitutional non-law school knowledge, you can only be impeached for things that you do while you're president.
Right.
So I don't think that could play with that. But what happens later, who knows? If he has administrative officials who, it turns out, still have economic ties to Russia, if if his Secretary of State still has economic ties, Secretary of State designate still has economic ties, this could change the ballgame.
Yeah.
But you also have to remember Republicans control the House by a large margin, the Senate by a narrow margin, and unless you have enough Republicans turning against him, more likely because popular opinion would affect their election campaigns, I'm not sure they would go through that. Because you could almost see the Democrats grinning with glee and dragging it out, simply hoping to hurt the Republicans. Now, on the upside, I think Congress on both sides would rather deal with a President Pence, who knows Congress, who, although very conservative, understands the government does have some role and understands how government fundamentally works, which I don't think Trump knows any of that.
I could continue,
He's
but
very quickly, but I'm not sure he does right now.
Yep. Okay, so Jonathan, what does your knowledge of Russian history and literature suggest will be the fate of Russia as an increasingly important global power?
I mean, history would say it's always going to be a major player, but it's almost always going to be a major player from a point of weakness, right? They can survive. I mean, if you look at, resilience, they kept the Mir space station up longer than anybody thought they could.
Yeah.
They keep a lot of things going on. So, I mean, they're a country that always hangs on. They're a country that is both blessed and cursed with a lot of natural resources. Very little way to get them out. If the climate continues to warm substantially, the former permafrost that kept them locked away will melt enough they'll have access to them, but they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to get them out. The danger, of course, on the other end of that is if it starts flooding the market, the prices go down. Russia right now is being hurt very much by the low price of oil. And one of the things that keeps it low is apparently the largest U.S. depository of oil about 20 miles south of me here. All these could very effectively keep Russia weak, both intentionally and unintentionally by outside powers. I think traditionally, the West has been fairly strong, I think, because they're democratic systems, because they're able to take the best of their people out of either some form of duty or some form of love of country. If you have autocratic systems where people are doing it out of fear, it's a lot harder. You can motivate people to work, but how hard are they going to work? I mean, I think all this comes into play. We could try to be optimistic about Russia. I think the world did make a good faith effort to be optimistic about Russia after 1991. In some ways, the West didn't always treat it well, right? They toyed with Russia. Are you going to be allowed to be in NATO or are you not? Are you going to be allowed to be in the EU or are you not? The way it's played out now, it's probably better they aren't in either. Putin's even come out and said, if I were in NATO, I'd be just trying to slow things down. But, Russia also has to decide what role it wants to play in the world. Does it want to play a positive role? Does it want to work well with its neighbors? Or does it simply want to be what it seems to be under Putin right now, which is just trying to dissemble and mess up the world order?
Obviously, there would be advantage for Russia to reach out and make a play for peace with Japan over the Kuril Island dispute. And we see that the latest outreach has been, well, can we say less than successful? In spite of, starting off with a bit of an optimistic bent. But Russian relations with China and Russian relations with India are interesting insofar as that Russia is happy to supply both with weapons, and you kind of think that with the narrative going the way that it has been, that Russia and China are really the sure bet in terms of forging some form of strategic accommodation. And yet China really, in the long game, is the biggest threat that Russia really faces, even more so than the United States in many instances, because you've got an underpopulated Siberia, the area of Vladivostok. I mean, all that area is essentially open space to be exploited by a much more populous and much more ambitious China to the south. So,
and China could essentially walk in tomorrow, and I think the only thing keeping them from doing that would be the court of public opinion would be highly negative.
Yeah, yeah.
So instead, they're doing it by simply building factories across the border, sort of creeping in deeper and deeper that way.
So actually, the idea of having good neighborly relations for Russia doesn't seem to be real, leaving Russia the only other option, and that is to play the spoiling role to ensure that there is no order being stacked against it. So playing the spoiling role is going to be its foreign policy for the foreseeable future, don't you think?
It is, but it's also hard to have a good neighborly policy with somebody like Japan when you've invaded Georgia, when you've invaded Crimea,
True.
when you're causing trouble in Syria. Then how can you expect a country, a country with a democratic tradition, in the modern age like Japan, to then turn around and suddenly trust Putin when he's shown himself to be so untrustworthy?
So finally, Jonathan, how do you see the recent assassination of Russian ambassador to Turkey, Andrei Karlov, and what impact do you think this is going to have on the Russian-led peace talks over Syria?
I mean, that's a tough question because it could go two ways. It could cause, a breakdown in Russian-Turkish relations, which have been on the upswing largely because the president of Turkey is, to be fair to him, a little fed up with Europe, a little fed up with this dragging out, are we going to let you in the EU or not? I think he's interested in creating sort of a strongman club. So that, so in that way Putin interests him. It could also drive Turkey and Russia closer together, assuming they finally figure out exactly where this gunman came from, what the links are. One report had him as someone who had been on Erdogan's presidential bodyguard detail, which would be interesting. They tried to blame it initially on the Gulen movement because that's sort of either the Kurds or they're the ones who always get blamed for anything or everything. It could push them together in an effort to go after other people, they don't like in both countries. It could drag Iran into the mix, where they all decide they have these common enemies they want to go after. But, when you're trying to build alliances based on common enemies, they don't always last that long, right? Look at the U.S. and the Soviet Union. We lasted through 4 or 5 years of World War II, and then we ended up on opposite sides again.
Okay, well, Jonathan, I think we can call that a successful wrap. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for listening, everyone. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to Strategicon through iTunes, SoundCloud, and YouTube, and please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We're always looking to pass on the most interesting information on international relations and security to our social media followers. And until next time, goodbye.
Are you a podcaster? Maybe you've got that big idea and you're looking for a network to join. The multi-award-winning Ozcast network can get your content to eyes and ears all over the world. Join now for the first month free, and you could be featuring this sound at the beginning of your podcast.
Ozcast.
Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.